Super logical arguments that are convincing, but somehow feel like they're missing something. Welcome, my mere mortalites, to another round of the book reviews. My name is Kyrin, and I do these book reviews for those who want to transcend beyond their own mere mortality, to get more of the juiciness out of the books they're reading, and perhaps even do some more good with their life. And that is what we're looking at today. We have The Most Good You Can Do by Peter Singer. This book was published in 2015, and it's about 180 pages in length, so not super thick. And it's essentially about the philosophy of effective altruism and doing the most good you can do in life and how you can do this. So altruism obviously is referring to donations. So it's talking about charities, how you can give to charities and what charities in particular that you should give to, and what causes are perhaps the most good you can do. So this is really looking at the effective part of the altruism. So there we go. This takes the form in the book of personal choices. So it talks, for example, about maybe what sort of job you could do that would be the most beneficial to, I suppose, humankind. And we'll talk about the value judgment shortly. You can talk about the donation recipient, so which charities are the most effective, which do the most good, and which causes in particular. You can talk about even volunteering and even donating body parts. So there's lots of examples thrown throughout the book of how you can be an effective altruist, i.e. do the most good you can do. This is based, I suppose, in the philosophy of utilitarianism. So it's really looking at numbers-wise, comparing things. So if you've heard of the trolley problem, for example, of one person on the tracks versus 5 persons on the tracks, do you pull the lever to save the 5 people and have the train run over the 1 person? Most of the people who follow effective altruism would say, yes, that's a good decision to make. More lives have been saved. So if you're wondering, like, in a general sense, what sort of philosophy it is, it's more inclined towards that. It's also talking about morals, though, and animal rights and climate change, existentialism. So it covers a vast range, I suppose, of moral and ethical principles. And we'll also talk about the difference between those two. It's pretty rational. I would say mostly rational. There's not many appeals to emotion and arguments related to that. Very actionable suggestions, and also has a lot of anticipatory arguments, for example. So whilst you're reading the book, you might think, oh, what about this? It'll typically cover that in there as well. Lots of data, and then also real world examples of effective altruists doing what they're doing. So I'll talk a little bit about the author and the setup of the book before going on to the main themes. Peter Singer is a bioethics professor at Princeton, I believe, and he's an Aussie philosopher, hence my little Aussie garb that I've got on here. I've previously reviewed one of his books before, which was Ethics into Action, which was following the life of Henry Spire and the animal activist rights, animal rights movement, I suppose you'd call it. And I've also read another book on this channel, or done a review of Doing Good Better by William McCaskill, which was also about effective altruism. So if you want more info on these topics, there's some other book reviews for you to follow. The book itself is split into 4 sections. That is this one, The Most Good You Can Do. Number 1, effective altruism. What is effective altruism and a movement emerges? Number 2, how to do the most good. So living modestly to give more, earning to give, other ethical careers, giving a part of yourself. Part 3, motivation and justification. Is love all we need? One among many, altruism and happiness. That's really talking about the, I suppose, more underlying aspects of it rather than the physical aspects. And then 4, choosing causes and organizations. So domestic or global, difficult comparisons. There's a whole bunch of subsections right in there. So I'll read out the little tagline here just to give a finality to the synopsis. Effective altruism is based on a very simple idea: we should do the most good we can. So yeah, there you go. That's the book in a nutshell. But let's get into some of the themes and the nitty gritty, the juicy stuff. So the first theme I've come up with is judging value, ethics versus morals. And what's the difference between the two? Well, it's not addressed in this book, or at least it's tangentially, but not directly looking at it. And so I did a little bit of my own, I suppose, research into this. And I guess you could say ethics are more external and community based, i.e., this might be something you'd find in a religion. What are the ethics of a religion? The maybe ethics of the Australian community, or the ethics of fair play in a sports game or something like that. So they're more maybe like unwritten rules that, but also including written rules of what someone should do and what is valued. Now, on the opposite end of this, or in contrast to this, are morals, and these are much more internal and individual. So I could have my own moral compass and say, and this is maybe related more to like how it shows up in politics for me. I might have an individual morality saying, I really hate waste, which is one of the things I really do hate, which might not be external and community driven like it is some of ethics. So there's a difference between the two of them, and it's important just to keep these in mind, because this book has a lot of suggestions in it, and most of them are related to the ethics side of things rather than the morals. So he's essentially saying in the book, Peter Singer, this is that it's better to donate rationally rather than subjectively. And you're probably going to find more rationality in the ethics sort of section, where it's more an external community-based set of rules or decisions rather than your own individual morality, because you're going to be a lot more emotional in that respect. So he's arguing, better for widespread effectiveness, in rather than direct in your face impact. So if you're going to donate to something, it's best not to do it just for the random guy you came across on the street who, for whatever reason, your morals said, I'm going to help that person, or I'm going to help that charity or cause because they're right in your face, and you get that feeling of, I suppose, like relief and gratitude and feeling like you're doing good. Rather, it's probably better to err more on the side of being a lot more critical with it, being a lot more rational, looking at the data and studies, and then saying, okay, this is how I can do the most good. So there's a lot of suggestions in the book of how you can do this. I won't particularly go through them, but there's a couple of websites you can look at. And I suppose also on this topic is, okay, this is sort of getting to something a little bit beneath, which is the wisdom of the crowd versus the individual. So why would it be better why is effective altruism more leaning towards the side of the crowd and external, multiple, like almost like a hive mind decision, rather than the individual, one person, their morality, and I think I can do good because of X reason. And so I think one of the other reasons would be saying you're going to have a lot more data in the sort of external one, because there's a lot more people coming in and making almost like decisions, or the data being formed of what is more effective or what is better for the world is probably going to, be more inclusive because there's more people sort of taking part of this, i.e., what's more better? Is it better that we try and reduce pollution here in the Brisbane River, or is it better that we try and reduce poverty over in Namibia, for example? And you could probably just get to the point where it's like, if you have enough data coming in, you could start to say, that's more of an aesthetic decision here in Brisbane. It's not killing people. It's not harming people, the pollution in the river. There are some externalities and there are bad things. There's no doubt about that. But you can do more good to the world, and this is where the values come in again. The values of, I suppose, reducing suffering, of good health for people, of living a better life, of even like inclusivity, if you want to put that as one of your values, and things like that. They're more of a group one, and so you'd probably leaning more towards the helping people in Namibia versus the Brisbane River. Whereas if you're an individual, you're probably going to be more concerned, Brisbane is my home, I want to clean up the river and things like this. So he's essentially saying, I guess, in the book that it's better to have the more hive mind. You're going to have more data. You're going to make better decisions in terms of trade-offs and things like that. unless, and this is where I'm adding my own little section, unless I think you've done your own research, you've really investigated a particular charity or a particular cause, and you are firmly convinced this is what is best, this is how we're going to, how I can do the most good, for example. And I'll read a little section here from page 51, which was saying this. Moral codes of behavior often give the principle do no harm priority over the principle do the most good you can do. And then says, those who will take this view will consider it wrong to work for a corporation that is harming innocent people, even if the good that one could do, can then do, would hugely outweigh this harm. And then he gives an example of during World War II, when Churchill had this sort of plan to have spies feeding data back to the German Nazis saying, oh yeah, your rockets are super accurate, when they weren't particularly accurate, which ended up in having more rockets falling on less densely populated parts of London, so more like the outer suburbs, rather than the direct hits in the middle of the city, which would kill more people. And in this case, he was sort of saying, the individual might say, oh, you're deciding that the life of the people in the suburbs is worth less than the people in the cities. Whereas the collective one would be more like more lives were saved because of this. And I think they had a number in there, which was 12,000, I believe. That this would save, it was estimated that this would save 12,000 casualties a month. So this is once again getting to the ethics, I suppose, the philosophy behind the ethics, which is more utilitarianism. Let's try and save the most people. There's always going to be trade-offs, and we need to focus on the most good we can do rather than how I feel as an individual. So that's one judging value right there. The next theme that I thought was relevant was doing, an emphasis on real-world results. So what sets apart effective altruism from just altruism, for example? So I suppose what I got out of it is there's almost like an emphasis on the directness. Now, this isn't a stated, line in the sand rule of effective altruism. This is merely what I've got from reading 2 or 3 books related to this topic, and this one in particular, which is almost like there's a here and now. There's you're in or you're not. The ideal is nice, but the nitty gritty practicality of everyday life dominates more in this philosophy, which is you want to see an impact. It's not about feeling good. It's about doing good. And so there's many examples of how effective altruists behave for example, and you could compare this to altruists and say, yeah, you know what? I think there's a difference between the two of them. So one example was a man called Zel Krasinski, who donated one of his kidneys anonymously. So this was where he just said, look, I don't care who gets the kidney. Most kidney donations are done because of family and friends trying to help out a loved one who is sick. But he did the research, said, you know what, this is how I could save a person's life. I can do a lot of good right here, right now. And I don't need the reason of it to be a family member to do this. It'll have minimal impact to my life. The risks of the surgery going wrong are very minimal as well. I'm going to do this. So that's one example of an effective altruist, and there's a whole line of reasoning as to how he came up to this decision of why this would be one of the most effective things that he personally could do. A lot of the examples of people in this book tended to lean towards the more engineering and mathematical types, which I think also probably suggests a little bit about effective altruism in that it's a lot more focused on data. It's very data heavy. There's people, for example, who would go into deciding on their career paths. I'm going to go into this niche area where I can have more of an impact. Maybe it might not be the most fun job I personally could have, but I can do more impact because this area is underserviced and I can make certain decisions that'll do well. So there's a lot of thinking about data, I suppose, in this. And so even you could be saying, okay, but how can you compare, the life, the hunger that a poor Namibian child would feel versus the helping out a homeless person in your own city. And this is where they get into even some quality or disability adjusted life years. So this is sort of figuring out, trying to put some numbers on things which are a lot more intangible. So, what is like the suffering or the amount of life years lost because a child doesn't get proper nutrition in this early stage of their life versus the homeless person who might have an earlier death because they're less likely to get medical attention, because they're more likely to have mental issues which could lead towards suicide or things like this. So they do put an emphasis on the data, and there is an acknowledgement, hey, this isn't definitive. This isn't, like I said, it's more nitty gritty. It's not perfect. It's not ideal, but we're trying to make the world a better place. And here's at least a step in the right direction. And there's a big focus on the data with that, which then I suppose translates into the doing aspect. So once you have the data, the next step is you got to follow it. So even though it might not feel as good to donate online anonymously, perhaps, or to these charities which maybe you're not 100% convinced on, or they don't have the real impact like your mum who died of cancer or things like this, but it'll do the most good, and you have some data. There's something better than just feel-good emotions to back that up. And they do this through meta websites, for example. So these are ones like GiveWell or The Life You Can Save, where the website has done the research into finding out, okay, which charities are the most effective and will get the most bang for your buck, I guess. So, if I put $1 of donation in, I will get $17 of good coming out from that. And this is where, once again, they've got some metrics on how can you measure what $17 of good is. How can I measure the joy, the reducing of suffering by feeding a small child in Namibia, for example. And they try and, there's at least a trying on it. Whether the metrics are 100% valid, who knows, but there's at least an acknowledgement like, hey, let's look at some of the data. And they also have plenty of other sort of studies on direct donations, for example. So one of the interesting things I found from the book was small donors give less when they are presented with the effectiveness of their charity versus just when there's no data. Because sometimes the small donor can be like, oh, the charity's doing well. They're doing a lot of effectiveness. I don't need to donate as much, so I'll stop. Whereas sometimes it's better for them to actually not receive any data, and that'll, make them, I suppose, not have the thought process that, oh, I've done all I can, wipe my hands and walk clean. There's definitely some ethical arguments on why you could say it's better for people to be more informed and to know what's actually happening, etc., etc. But we'll leave that for here. That's a whole nother argument going on there. So some of my own observations and takeaways before getting into the summary. The book is convincing, but as I mentioned right at the start, it feels like something is missing, and this would take a whole lot of time to explain. So I'm just going to say, check out my book recap at the end of the month, and that'll give a lot more of my thoughts, because I've taken a whole bunch of notes. I won't take up all the time in here, but there is something that feels like it's like a little bit missing from the arguments of effective altruism, and I'm going to try and detail what it is there. So go check that out for more. One of the things I really appreciate from this book was you could see that a lot of skill, time, effort, energy, and thought has been put into the writing of it, and also the arguments contained within. And just to highlight this, I was talking on the Mere Mortals podcast with Juan recently about a donation. He said he'd made a small donation recently, and I transitioned into this topic, and I could tell Juan was not impressed. He doesn't particularly like the idea of effective altruism, and he was coming up with a whole bunch of arguments, and these were arguments I had in my own head whilst reading this book as well. So it's not just him. There's it seems like there can be a reaction from people as to why effective altruism is not so great. Anywho, most of the arguments that Juan brought up, I could instantly go, Peter Singer already addressed that in this book. Like, he already talked about that particular point, made a bunch of really convincing arguments of why that point is either not necessary or why you haven't considered this, or et cetera, et cetera. So even though the book feels like it's missing something, I really do appreciate that he's put a lot of time into I suppose these arguments, and has obviously had these same discussions multiple times with multiple people, because he knew which arguments would probably come up in his own reader's mind, and sort of was able to address it in the book. So it was almost like you were having a mini conversation with Peter, because he would sort of anticipate your own next move, which I quite enjoyed. And there's a link to that episode with Juan around as well. I think one of the things that really, my own observation takeaway is, I used to do pragmatic takeaways right at the end after the summary. And I stopped doing that because I was reading so many books that it sort of felt shallow after a while. It was like, there's only so many pragmatic things I can do. And when I'm reading 2 books a week, which I was at the time, it was sort of taking away from that. But one thing I did take from this was, when I had read William McCaskill's book about effective altruism, I found the arguments convincing enough to start donating. And so I was doing that for a period of time, probably 6 to 9 months, if I had to guess. And then after a while, I stopped. I just went, like, I'm not feeling it anymore. The rationality, the arguments, they'd lost some impact. But I'm obviously still interested in these books. This is, almost the third one related to this topic of altruism or donating in charities. And I would personally feel, I suppose, a little bit shallow if I'm reading these, I'm making arguments, I'm putting obviously time and effort into doing a book review on them, if I didn't follow through on it as well. So I've restarted donating to charity because of that. It'll be about 1% of my monthly of my annual income pre-tax. So it's not going to be a world-changing amount, but at least I'm making an effort and doing something. So just one of those things where it's like that I talked about value judgments and doing in this book. I should fucking do it. So that's one right there. There was one thing though that Juan came up with, and which I thought was poignant, which was, I wonder if they've thought on doing a study of the effectiveness of the effective altruism brand. So, for example, maybe people would donate to charities more, but because they're donating to these certain charities where they don't have that emotional impact to them, they end up donating less overall. I would probably imagine they've thought of this, but if there was an actual study or some data to prove that would be nice. And the other thing you'd probably be able to argue is, because the charities that you're donating to are so much more effective than any of the others, then they might be, 10 times more effective. So you'd only need to do 1/10 of the donation for either duration or total amount, and you'd still come out ahead or equal. So some arguments there to be made, which it's a fascinating topic, and this book gets right to the heart of morals and ethics. So lots of fun things there. In summary, it's a bit of a conflicting read, to be honest, for me. On the one hand, it's very logical and presents a whole lot of great arguments and data, and then on the other hand, I just noticed myself fighting against it somehow, and it was a weird balance. It was a weird mix of reading and feelings as was going on. I think it's a very good intro for those who haven't heard of effective altruism before. Lays it out quite nicely, and hopefully will also make you become a bit more of an effective altruist if you follow the guidelines in here. I suppose if you follow the rationality and thinking behind it, I hope this will actually impact your decisions and how you donate. And I suppose I feel it's like a book that almost needs to sink in for a bit. So if you read it, and whilst reading it, you're finding yourself sort of, I don't know, fighting against it. I think that's a normal feeling. That's certainly what I had. But after a while, I decided to donate, and it did actually affect my decisions. So, and my real world, I suppose, had some impacts in the real world because of that. And I like that. I like books that are, that you can take something out of and apply to your own life. I do like that. It's not ethics and morality. It's not just in your head. It's also how you apply that to the world. So overall, I'm going to give The Most Good You Can Do by Peter Singer a 7 out of 10. It's solid. It's a solid read. And that is it for today, my mere mortalites. Thank you for joining me to this part of the book review, to the video. What are your thoughts on Peter Singer? Have you read any of his works before on effective altruism? Do you donate? Do you give to charity? If so, have you thought about the effectiveness on these charities? He didn't talk about it in this book, but there's a lot of shitty charities out there. So I hope you've thought about that at least a little bit, because there's ones ranging from the outright scams to incompetent to just suboptimal to as good as you can do. And it's definitely worth thinking about. Leave me a comment, and also subscribe if you want to, I suppose, if you're enjoying these book reviews. This one was certainly a long one. And I really do hope you're having a fantastic day wherever you are in the world. Kyrin out.